Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. In today's episode, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Maureen Warner-Lewis, renowned scholar of African and Caribbean cultural history. Together, we explore the remarkable life of Archibald Monteath, an Igbo man from West Africa who was enslaved in Jamaica, gained his freedom, and became a devoted member of the Moravian Church. Monteith's autobiography is one of the rare first-person narratives written by an African Jamaican in the 19th century. His story provides a unique window into questions of identity, spirituality, survival, and belonging in colonial Jamaica. Through his life, we uncover the enduring presence of Igbo heritage, the impact of Christianity and the Moravian mission, and the ways enslaved and freed Africans navigated cultural erasure while holding on to memory. This is more than the story of one man. It's a powerful testament to resilience, faith, and cultural survival within the wider history of slavery and emancipation in the Caribbean. So settle in, and let's begin this inspiring conversation with Dr. Maureen Warner-Lewis.
Maureen Warner-Lewis,
Okay.
the Emeritus Professor of African Caribbean Language and Orature in the Department of Literatures and English at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. I taught at the university for about 33 years, and I'm now retired. During the course of my academic career, I have written about 5 books dealing with African cultural retentions in the Caribbean, which involve language use, the use of African languages, and the foods, the religious beliefs, the whatever else there is about their lives, the lives of the people who came or were brought to the Caribbean.
Thank you, Professor Warner-Lewis. I really do appreciate that for you coming on to the podcast and to speak about your book, Archibald Monteath, Igbo Jamaican Moravian. Hopefully I got that right. And Moravians, thank you. And so, for the listeners that are new to this particular subject, would you be able to explain who was Archibald Monteath and why his story is so significant to Caribbean and African diaspora history?
Well, the story of Archibald Monteath is significant because there are very few Caribbean slave narratives. The slavery regime existed in the Caribbean for about 400 years. And during that time, we have virtually no testimony from the enslaved people about how their lives were conducted. The slave narratives which exist are known to exist now is that of Juan Francisco Manzano and Esteban Montejo, both of Cuba. Esteban Montejo later he moved from slavery into being a runaway slave, and he fought in the War of Independence of Cuba from Spain. Then there's the story of Ashton Warner from St. Vincent, and Mary Prince, who was enslaved in Bermuda, Antigua, and the Turks and Caicos Islands, and Rebecca Proton of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. Otherwise, we have a few fragments or condensed life stories, but not personal testimonies of these people.
Yeah, and that is so very important to get their testimony, their
Yes.
witness account as to what, because when you're just reading through the records, you're inferring what you believe that they probably would have went through, and that is just horrific in and of itself. But these testimonies are definitely significant in what has happened for them. And so, what does Monteith's Igbo origin tell us about the diversity of African peoples that were enslaved and brought to Jamaica?
Well, the Igbo, they were called in Jamaica largely Moko, which is apparently the name of one of the ports, or Muko, through which they passed coming to the Caribbean. But the word Moko, I spell it Moko, covers not only Igbo people, but also the Ibibio, the Efik, Ogoni, and Ejagam, all from the Niger Delta, which is in present-day Nigeria. And in Jamaica, where I live, there are several places called Moko, spelled Mocho. And the word Igbo remains in the term for a reddish-skinned person. Redibo is what they say in Jamaica. And that is a red Igbo, because a number of the Igbo, not all of them, but some of them, have this reddish cast of complexion. And there are other ethnic place names in the Caribbean. In Trinidad, there's a place called Sobo Town in honor of the Sobo people, again from the Niger Delta. In Jamaica, there are places with the name Nago. Nago is another name for the Yoruba people who live today largely in southwestern Nigeria, but also in the eastern part of Dahomey, or what used to be called Dahomey, which is now the Republic of Benin. There's also a place in Jamaica called Benin, and there's another place called Abekita, which is a version of the place name in southern Nigeria, Abeokuta. And there's a place in Jamaica called Akompong, which is an Akan name, and there's a Congo town, and so on. Now, a number of Igbo were brought to Jamaica, clearly, and Igbo children were known to be plentiful in the slave cohorts of the late 19th century, the late 18th century, early 19th century. And the reason that the number of children, like Archibald himself, were brought over was because they were easier to manage. They were more manageable, and they could more easily adapt to the very stringent conditions of slave life in the Caribbean. So, but there are other groups of people, a number of the Ashanti and Coromantee, so-called Coromantee people. Though Coromantee is the name of the town through which they exited modern day Ghana, or what was then the Gold Coast. So there were Ashanti people, there were Coromantee or Fanti people, there were Temne from the Sierra Leone, Liberia area, there were Wolof, there were Mandinka from present-day Gambia and Guinea and Senegal, and of course there were lots of Congo, people from the Congo and Angola. So quite a motley group of people were brought.
Yes, and as you mentioned, he was a child when he was brought over.
Yes, Archibald, we of course we do not know his age. There were nothing like what the Jamaicans call birth paper at that time in Africa. And so we don't know exactly when he was born, but from his conduct, when he was tricked into accompanying an older male to see a big market, I estimate that he must have been around 9 or 10 years of age, there around, when he was brought. And the person who bought him in Jamaica was a Scotsman from Glasgow, and he bought a whole batch of 11 young boys at the same time. So it was, the children, of course, were cheaper. So, and it seems as if he was on board the boat for several weeks before being sold. And so these little boys were sort of probably like the leftovers from the shipment that had come. The stronger, more able-bodied people had been probably bought by the more wealthy planters and so on.
Yeah, that was definitely mentioned in the book. And then how did Monteith, be able to navigate the trauma of enslavement while maintaining a sense of Igbo identity?
Well, he had a strong sense of his family lineage. This is obvious from his story. On both maternal and paternal sides, his family background had some amount of prestige in the societies from which they came. And he conveys this by laying a lot of emphasis on the markings that he was to have had carved on his face. Some parallel lines on the forehead, which were put on children of that kind of noble lineage. And he was taken away from Igbo land before these markings could be put on his face. These markings were called Ichi. And perhaps it is that the Europeans were not too particular, were not too keen on having people with too many markings on their face, which meant nothing to them. But these markings delineated certain class positions among the Igbo, which would distinguish them whatever part of Igbo land they went. They would be known to be classified as X kind of people. And his subgroup of Igbo were called the Nri, Nri, the Nri people. And they were known for espousing certain moral values. They saw to the establishment of priesthoods and the establishment of marketplaces, which of course in West Africa extremely important. Marketplaces were the site of all sorts of activity. If you think of even our markets in the Caribbean, how noisy they are, and, people meet there on a regular basis, and there's a whole community of people who sell in the market. There are people who buy regularly from certain vendors and so on. So the marketplace was a site of a meeting place for people. And so the markets had to be ritually cleansed. And this cleansing was done by the Nri people, the Nri priests, the priests among the Nri people. So that is just some of the activities of the Nri. They also were they were pacifists. They did not believe in war. They believed in peace, and they considered certain actions like incest and murder and so on to be what they call in abominations, or things that should not be done, taboo things that should not be done. And I was wondering today even if it might be that one of the reasons that Archibald, when he grew to be a big man in the southwestern Jamaica where he was taken to, if he did not why he did not join in the big slave uprising of 1831 to 32, could one of the reasons have been that he did not approve of murder? I hadn't thought of that before, but it came to me today that might have been one of his reasons, that he did not want to be involved in an activity which involved killing other people, even if those people were your oppressors.
Definitely. And I guess this is, in what ways does his life story kind of challenge or confirm what we know about enslaved African adaptation to Jamaican society during that time?
Well, it was important. One of the things, and which applies in his case, was the age at which the enslaved were introduced into plantation society. If you got them early, they could be groomed, as they say now. They could be groomed, and they would have been at an age to learn the values of slave society, which was unlike anything that they would have known before. There were certain castes, I call them, in plantation society, and these caste differences were largely based on color, skin color. And this was a factor which was not particularly important in African societies. There were in African societies people of different shades of black to fair brown or red. But these did not dictate the class status of the person, as that factor of skin color was, the importance and significance which skin color had in plantation society was not the same as the African understanding of different shades of person. And when they were young, they would also learn the labor regime of the pen. A pen in Jamaica would be a farm or an estate which bred horses and cattle and mules and so on. Because remember, these are days when draft animals were very important. So animals were reared not only for their meat, but also to serve as means of transport. So they would learn the labor regime, how to look after horses, how to look after pigs, and so on. So that the story confirms the importance, his story confirms the importance, even for a person who came in at a young age, the importance of freedom. It was a wished for state of being, even among those who had been long enslaved, like Archibald, who was enslaved for about 35 years before he was able to buy his own freedom in 1837. Some people, however, were confirmed in their state of enslavement, probably because they were born into it and saw it, as the Jamaicans would say, is so the thing set.
Yeah.
The world was established like that, and they knew no other way of being. But in Archibald's case, he knew that he was born into the caste in Igbo land called the Diala, which is the free-born people, because there were slaves in Igbo land, domestic slaves as well as cult or religious slaves. But he was not in that category at all. And so I think that his desire for freedom was to establish, to regain, to reestablish his self as a freeborn human being.
Mm-hmm. It's like going back to his self and what he was
Yes,
put into, right? So,
yes.
of course. And then, of course, what role did the Moravian church play in Monteith's life, and how did his conversion influence his identity and opportunities?
Well, the Moravian church gave Monteith the opportunity to distinguish himself in another sphere of activity. Here is this young boy, 9 or 10. He works as a servant in the house, then he works out in the fields, and he rises to become what they call then a driver, meaning a kind of sub overseer
Mm-hmm.
of people like himself, the enslaved. So he is going up the sort of class ladder among the slaves by becoming a driver. But when he joins the Moravian church, this is another sphere of activity in which he can also show leadership qualities. So I don't think he joined in order to become a leader. He joined for spiritual reasons, but the church establishment gave him the opportunity to shine. And more than that, it allowed him to learn to read and write. Again, he didn't join in order to learn to read and write. But having joined the prayer group, even before the Moravian church established itself in his locality, he was invited by some white women who who held the prayer meetings that he used to go to. He was asked by them, did he want to learn to read and write? And he said yes. So this gave him an opportunity to acquire a skill which was absolutely rare
Yes.
among the enslaved. And so much so that his colleagues laughed at him. The girlfriend that he was living with at the time, she laughed at him. And they said, what do you want with the white people business and so on? And he had obviously had a stubborn streak, and he stuck to his guns, and he learned to read and write. And this, he became, therefore, extremely invaluable to the missionaries. And this is why he rose so high in the Moravian church of his time in Jamaica, because he not only he obviously was intelligent, he could speak well, he had the gift of persuasion, he could preach well and speak well. He knew enough Igbo to translate from Igbo to English and English to Igbo in the missionaries dealing with people who spoke the Igbo language. And he could read the Bible for himself, and he could write. And that gave him, even for some of the Africans who came were Muslim, some of them. And some of the Muslims could read Arabic and write as well. And when the slave owners discovered that these people were literate, they gave them jobs like storekeeper to keep records of for the estate. How many bags of this, how many barrels of that, this, that, the next. So that their positions, even in and under enslavement, were greatly improved because of their literacy. And Archibald, although he was not a Muslim, he learned from the Europeans in his locality. Not his owners, not his owners. They didn't teach him to read and write. It was the people involved with the church activities in his location who invited him, and he accepted that he wanted to read and write.
It definitely opened up another opportunity and another, I guess, elevation within himself as well.
Yes.
That it almost sounds as if he was, tapping into his original self from where he came from, even though it may not have been exactly the same, but on the same, I guess, vein, I guess you can kind of say, right?
Quite.
Yeah. So, and how did, again, with religion serve as both, a tool of colonial control and a space for spiritual resilience in Monteith's experience?
Well, religion brought Monteith into a further area of colonial control. We have here a dialectic. He is enslaved in a labor regime operated by the Europeans. So he's under colonial control in that sphere. And then he joins up with the European church people, and he gets into another area of colonial control. But on the other hand, it turns out that the values of Christianity were akin to the ethos of the Inri group of Igbo from which he came. That is the promotion of peace, because the Moravians did not encourage revolt. They preached that the slaves should submit to their owners. So peace, moral purity, and the sense of taboos, these abominations in social and spiritual life, like he was taught by these European evangelical people that dancing was immoral. So he stopped dancing. He had liked to dance. He stopped that. Also, he was obviously cohabiting with various women. He was taught that that was wrong. even though he saw that the European planters and so on were living with several women and abusing the slave women. And if you want to understand the abuse of the slave women, you have to read Thomas Thistlewood's diaries, how he would make a note of which enslaved woman he slept with and where he slept with her and whether it was good or whether it was bad. And it would disgust you to read of his abuse of these women. And these women had to put up with it, you know. They had to put up with it. And they had to, you know, when he got his venereal disease, he passed it from one to the other and so on. It is very disgusting. So these he learned of certain taboos because the missionaries, they promulgated the belief that one man, one wife. That was their creed. And so he he accepted that creed as, you know, the right, the moral thing to do. Because his own Igbo name was Anyaso, and it meant what the Earth Mother prohibits. Because the Earth, all these moral qualities were associated in Igbo theology with the Earth Mother, whose name was Ani, Ani, Annie.
And then for you to be able to put all of this records together, like what type of records that you looked at? Did you have to go to the archives in terms of piecing together his life stories, like the church records or the missionary writings? What did you use to be able to write this?
Oh, a lot of digging up. Yes, archives both in Jamaica and in Scotland and in the US. There's the Moravian headquarters in the US is at a town called Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. And as a matter of fact, one of the best versions of Archibald's story is to be seen there in the handwriting of the missionary Joseph Kuma, who took down his story and put it into a sort of an exercise book, all handwritten. Of course, in those days, he had nothing like typewriters or computers. So the archives in Scotland were useful because I wanted to understand something more of the slave owners, Anyaso's slave owners' life and his motivations and so on, than, you know, just saying that John Monteath, that was his name. John Monteath was Anyaso's slave owner. I wanted to understand something about his finances and the finances of his family because there was evidence from, I think, in the Jamaican archives here of in what they call the old deeds, tomes at the Jamaica archives. There was evidence that John Monteith had, from time to time, raised certain sums of money from other Scots people to enable him to buy land and so on. So I wanted to understand something more of his family history, the family history of the enslaver, and his financial standing and his finances. So, but my so deeds, the this the tomes on deeds in the archives also give you ideas about information about land and property acquisition, at the register or what is called the returns of slaves, which were 3 yearly registers of the slaves on various estates. Very important. The, those if you know the estate to which your ancestor belonged, you can look into these 3 yearly returns and see the names, the slave names, and so on. And, whether they were pregnant, whether they had a child, whether they died, when they died, and so on. All that information is there in the returns of slaves. That's important. And what helped me a lot to understand the life of the enslaved were the missionary writings. The Moravian missionaries kept diaries for each of their stations or churches, and that those are very important. They give you an idea of of the how did people respond to their preaching. Obviously, some people liked what they were saying, and some people resisted them because the missionaries tried to ban out drumming. And the people say, but we have to have something for ourselves, and so on. You can't interfere so far as to ban our entertainments. And so it is clear that some people accepted the European intrusion into their life, and some people resisted and said, no, you're going too far. Yes. So missionary writings were very important, and registers for, say, the Anglican Church, Church of England, in this case, of registers of birth and death and marriage. These are important. So it's a lot of digging up. Yes. And a lot of, if you have allergies, you'd have to wear a mask to cope with these old books, huge books with all these information.
Yeah, you're definitely breathing in a lot of hundreds of years old dust.
Yes.
And it can, if you don't have any gloves on, it will make your hands very dirty to be able to do that. But this is what, brings a person kind of back to life in a way. It provides more flesh or more information on them so you can get a much better idea of who they were. And I guess for you, like looking at these sources, what were some of the challenges, or what challenges do historians face, of course, in interpreting?
Well, these sources are valuable, but there are gaps
Yes.
in the information. The bare fact of a name, whether she had a child or doesn't tell you doesn't tell you if the child survived, doesn't tell you what was her attitude towards the father of the child, because fathers are not mentioned in these estate records at all. Yeah. Because the woman was seen as the agent through which the owner would acquire more property, i.e., children, i.e., workers. So the mother was important, but the father could be Tom, Dick, or Harry. It didn't matter. So there are gaps in the thing. For instance, in Archibald's story, he doesn't, or either he didn't, or the missionaries didn't include it. He doesn't say anything about the type of work that he did. So you have to, apart from being a playmate of his owner's children, he just says, that he went out into the fields or something, but he doesn't give any detail of his life as a worker and what punishments he got. He just says that his owner was harsh towards him. That is the son of his first owner. The son was a mixed race person, and he was at one stage harsh towards him. But did it imply flogging? We are not told. Nor are we told how did Archibald discharge his job as a driver, since he was driving other people to work. Was he flogging them to work harder? Was he shouting at them? Was he cruel? Was he kind? Was he compassionate? We have no idea. We know that he seems to have received a lot of respect from his church members. But, exactly how his fellow slaves interacted with him, we are not sure. So there are also linguistic challenges that the historians have to face with regard to spellings and the pronunciation of names, because he pronounces some names differently from how they are in fact. You get the fact from the estate records, and he pronounces the names differently. So yes. So you also have to deal with the cultural biases of the writers. The missionaries talking about our people. That's the converts that they make and so on. That sense of possession and ownership and control and so on. So these sources reveal the predilection of their writers and what they disparage, what they wish to promote, and so on. For instance, they were dead set against the Junkanoo masquerade and did as much as they could to suppress that custom. So that is why Jamaica has never developed a carnival until recent years and so on. They have imported the Trinidad brand and so on. But so you have to sift the sources and take into consideration who is expressing an opinion and what are their cultural and religious biases.
Definitely. And because especially those slave registers that were produced every 3 years, there's a lot of information on there. And yes, it is for the mother's line primarily, but sometimes it would update to say, yes, this person, it decreased because of death or something like that.
Yes.
But there was definitely no individuality on those things, because I think I remember seeing, Mary number 155 or something like that. That's how they named people and identified them. So definitely not, I guess, you're looking at a very unforgiving environment per se. And then how does this, this story help us understand, of course, the complexities of identity in colonial Jamaica, being Igbo, enslaved, Christian, and then later Moravian?
Well, the story provides details of white-black interaction and black mulatto interaction, mulattoes being the product of white and black and so on. And there are different gradations in the population. So you get to find out his relationship with colored people. For instance, his second owner, inverted commas, the son of his first owner. That son is a mixed race person, and it would appear that the relationship is very on and off. Sometimes the James, the new owner, is kind towards him, like when he had rheumatism and he sent him to the seaside to bathe and so on. But also that he wanted to prevent him from getting married to the person he wanted to marry. And he obviously didn't like the extent of his interaction with the church people. And then he wanted to charge a whole lot of money for Archibald to be manumitted, and so on. So you get to understand the relationship between someone enslaved like Archibald and those who held power like other estate owners. They also the magistrate Daughtry, who gives him advice about when to apply for his manumission, and his relationship with the missionaries, because he becomes the eyes and ears of the missionaries. So it's a very, some of it probably is not too savory.
Yes.
Which is similar to his position on the estate as a driver, because he's acting on behalf of the owners of the other enslaved peoples. He is between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Yes. Yeah. And, why is it important, for Caribbean and African diaspora communities to remember individuals like Archibald Monteath?
Well, to read the Archibald story is to understand how the enslaved helped to shape the world we now inherit by their labor, by their sufferings, by their spiritual resilience, their desire for freedom, their sense of injustice. It is important to hear their words, to see the world from their angle, and not just to not to be able just to talk about the slaves as a kind of mass collective of people, but to recognize that there were individuals among them. And just as people nowadays have differing opinions, they too had different opinions, different approaches to their situations, etc. So we get to know in a more specific way the intricacies of life in our part of the world at certain historical periods of time.
Definitely. And then, as we come to a close, Professor Warner Lewis, how might his story inspire people today who are researching their own family history or cultural heritage?
The story inspires us to recognize that, to have a deeper understanding of actual slave life, which is what I said just now, that they were not shut off from national and international events. For instance, they received news by what in Trinidad we used to call the niggergram. By word of mouth, they received news of the fact that abolition of the slavery was about to come, and that bred a certain amount of unrest among them. They met with neighbors. Archibald meets with it's a lady from another estate, a neighboring estate, who encourages him to join the prayer meeting and so on. And there another Igbo person, a lady, Mary Brown. She is on an estate not far from him, and one of the people who was bought with him is at another estate, a man at the Woodlands estate, and so on. So they also the enslaved also belong to international. They had a certain amount of international outreach in that they raised money through the church. They raised money for evangelical work in other parts of the world, even as far as Greenland. I don't know if they knew where Greenland was. So the reservations that I found in the doing this work, I had set out to prove the biological connection between Archibald and people, relatives, in-laws of mine here in Jamaica, persons alive today. I thought this would be a wonderful example of how it would be possible to trace back into slavery times to connect people today with those who lived before. But my findings were contradicted or qualified by what I found and what I did not find.
Yes.
So that in spite of oral assertions by people today who think that Archibald was, one of their ancestors, I could not prove this by doing, the actual research. Yes, Archibald would have known, he did know ancestors of the people alive today. He did know. And his ancestors are probably somewhere in Jamaica or they migrated.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So, but that's another level of research would be needed to prove who, in fact, are the biological descendants of Archibald Monteath. But I'm glad to say that even in today's newspapers, one of today's newspapers here, a journalist has written up the story of Archibald in that his is probably one of the only or the few burial sites of an enslaved person that we can identify. Because his name is written on, he was held in such high esteem by the Moravians that he was given a burial spot alongside and among the missionaries, the foreign missionaries who served at that church, the New Carmel Church in Westmoreland. And his name is written, and it says that he's born in Africa, and they give some putative dates, when he was born and when he died. But I don't think, I don't agree. I am not the only one who does not agree with the date of birth which they put on the thing. But yes, so, so that is my contribution to the story of one of the few slave narratives from the Caribbean that we have. And it is of, I would say, a laudable personality. Obviously, someone with a lot of force of character. And in some ways, an example which, which we can follow.
Yes.
In some ways, though there are other ways that we know not of.
Yes. Yeah. No, but his story definitely gives light to what was happening during that time, which we don't normally always get because it only is coming from one perspective. And there's a lot of inference that you have to use when you're looking at some of these documents, right? So, but I do want to thank you so much, Professor Warner Lewis, for coming on to the podcast and discussing this, taking the time to discuss this, because again, it's part of that untold narrative part of what I've been discussing here on the podcast of stories not told, but the challenges that you face when you are then doing, as you indicated, a biological, genealogical research. So thank you.
And it takes years.
Yes. Yes, it does. So thank you so much. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.